Welcome to this second webinar dedicated to methodologies and best practices for your business process automation project with Bonita. First of all, let me introduce myself. I am Delphine Coille. I've been working for Bonitasoft for the last 6 years, and I am Evangelist and Community Manager. As an evangelist, community manager, and before as the customer success manager of this company, I experienced lots of projects with our consultants, with partners, and I thought it would be useful to share with you all tips and tricks as we are close to Halloween about methodologies, about projects, about best practices with Bonita. That's why this series has been created. We will go deeper today about the implementation, and I suggest that we start now. Before we start, if you have questions, and I will love this session to be as interactive as possible, please feel free to add them in the chat box. And if at the end you want to talk, you want to give your own feedback, or if you still have questions, we will leave 15 minutes for question and answers. So feel free to add your question in the chat box or put your hand on and I will open your mic. Let's start now. So let me come back to the slides. Yes. Just before we start, I wanted to do a kind of quick reminder about the BPM Project Lifecycle, because when we talk about automation, business process automation or optimization, we often think about BPM as the central and core concept of this automation. How do you build, deploy, and improve a BPM project? Through five phases. The first one is the discovery design that I talked about during our first webinar. The second one will be the concrete development, the implementation. Then you will deploy it in production and use it in production. In order to be in the continuous improvement loop, you are going to monitor your project, monitor the results and the improvements you saw. And then as part of the optimization, you are going to see what you still have to change and come back to a new cycle. So last time, when we talked about discovery and design, that was our start. And what we talked about was what to do before going deeper into the development project. So if I just want to sum up for those who didn't attend the first webinar, or just to give you a quick reminder, here are the outputs from the discovery phase. You should set it up with your business users, because I don't know if you remember, but the fact is that we really encourage you to work together hand in hand between IT team and business users. So when you hand your discovery phase, you will set your goals, the objectives of your project, and also the expected values. What you want to reach, which value you want to bring through this digital transformation. And in order to start with something, you will choose the first process you are going to optimize. Don't forget, this first process has to be a core process, because you need to make sure that people will be motivated to change. You will make sure that also the management and the top direction will be motivated and will sponsor it, and they will see a real value. And also because then people see the benefit for the company. But it has to be also a process that is not too complex. Otherwise, you are going to focus on complexity and not on bringing value. Then when you have set everything, the values, you will choose metrics and you will keep them in mind in order to make sure that you can measure what you have done versus your objectives when it will be in production. And last but not least, you have already defined your project stakeholders. We talked about personas. That's a very good way to make sure that you won't forget any stakeholder, because most of the time we think about the IT team, the developer, you can have, for example, the project manager, the architect, even sometimes a database leader or manager, but you don't have to forget the business users as well that will be part of the project. So now everything is set to start, and to start with the implementation. So we are ready to begin. But what are you doing really during this implementation? You are going to define the process, so design it. You are going to do developments, and in this case I'm talking to developments with Bonita, for example. You define your data model, you are going to develop your user interface, you are going to set up the connectivity with the rest of the information system. Then you are going to integrate everything, test it, and package all the artifacts to build and prepare the deployment. So before all, it's really important to think about the way you are going to implement all those artifacts and the way you are going to build your project. Why it is so important? First of all, because you have different ways and methodologies to implement. We will see that a bit later, but you have, for example, the Waterfall methodology, the Agile methodologies such as Scrum, Kanban, for example. You can be a lean fan. You have different ways to implement it and to make sure you will bring value and optimize your project. Depending on your choices, it might impact your project timely and costly. Moreover, Bonita, and if I take Bonita as an example, is an open and flexible solution. That's great because it's easy to do whatever you want with Bonita. You can use your own user interface, you can develop custom widgets, you can develop custom connectors, you can develop your REST APIs, you can do many things. You can use Bonita engine as an orchestrator. That's great. But sometimes if you are not cautious, you are going to follow bad practices, and that also can have huge impacts. I will take a simple example here. We had a French insurance company that needed to sort out reports and run reports regularly. Those reports were taking data in several databases. What they did, they wanted to have something running regularly, so doing loops, and actually it was not so complex in terms of steps, but it was complex in terms of data and case. What they did, they started to build a loop, but the fact is that they built an unending process. And actually in BPM there is a rule: a process has a start and it has an end. And if you want to loop, you don't have to do an unending process, or you will have infinite loops. Then you will fill in the database, and you will have timeout, and you won't be able to run your process properly. So you can benefit from Bonita design capabilities, and for example the way that you can use structured and also unstructured tasks to perform your processes, but be aware and cautious about the way you are going to use Bonita. We are going also to talk about that in details later. Then last but not least, as you want to save time, you want to avoid waste, you want to make sure that you have a productivity, continuous improvement, and save money, you want to optimize your business processes. This means long-term thinking. Why? Because you are not going to do that in a row. You will need to do kind of try and test and redo. You know, you cannot do everything in at once, because you need to test. You are not sure about the future. Your organization is changing, so you have to think about the next cycles, about the continuous improvement, and also about something very important: maintenance. Why? Because in most companies, your maintenance team is different from your development team. And if you develop just thinking about the first process you are going to put in production, it can be very difficult to maintain depending on the way you are going to design it and develop it. And then if you are in a continuous improvement loop, your production team is not especially on the same rhythm. So keep that in mind as well. Saying that, now hands on. We have to go deeper in the way to do it, because otherwise we can't start developing and implementing our first process. We were talking about methodologies. I guess that everybody knows Waterfall and Agile methodologies today, because they have been kind of opposed for a long time ago, sorry. And we always think about that. Everybody is talking about Agile. People are sometimes saying Waterfall is very old, but Waterfall is still used in many companies. And especially if I take the example of a British company, one of our customers working in the supply industry, they used Waterfall to implement their project with Bonita. So when we came to them, they had already started the discovery phase, and they had defined all the requirements with their customer. Well, the customer, the business user, I guess you understand. So they said, okay, we have a very good contract. We have a document setting all the requirements from our customer, and we can start designing and implementing. So what they did is designing on their side the process using I don't remember which tool. I don't remember if it was Aris or, but well, they designed the process and then they implemented it in Bonita. It took more or less 2 or 3 months to do that. And when they showed the process to their customer for testing, they said, yeah, actually, we thought it would be better to do it this way. Okay, back to the first step. They had to change all the requirements and start again with all the design and implementation, because as Bonita has dependencies, as you have different layers, they had to redo everything, and they lost a lot of time. That's why in this kind of project, impacting your organization, impacting the way you are going to work, impacting the order in your tasks, sometimes we really advise you to remain on an agile mode. Okay, which kind of agility are we going to recommend? The methodology we really recommend is to deliver at each iteration, at each sprint, the smallest deliverable and usable value, including all product layers. Why? Because then you will have regular delivery. For example, you can decide to deliver every 2 or 3 weeks to your set of users that are working in your project. You will give users visibility. even if it's not for all users, as at the beginning in your discovery phase, you have defined a set of users working with you, they will see it every 3 weeks and they can tell you, okay, for that, I would prefer that we change that. More than that, you will build it progressively, which means that you will build it step by step. So you are not supposed to remove features nor make major changes. And that's important here because for those who have worked a lot with Bonita, and I know that some of you already know Bonita for years, Bonita is quite easy and give you lots of abilities to build it and to build your process and to do whatever you want. The issue comes more when you want to do changes or even remove features, because as there are lots of dependencies between variables, between the data layer, the process layer, the user interface layer, also with the connectivity, it's difficult to change that. And especially as in production, your processes can be running and some instances of your processes are going to run for months, sometimes for years. If you make many changes that, for example, remove data, you might have conflicts and discrepancy in your data model and the way your process is running. Also, why? Because it's easy to automate. If you do that, you will do your best, and that's what we advise you to do, to use the automation tools and also the collaboration tool, Git, Jenkins, and so on. So that's why we suggest, and that's what we do at Bonitasoft. That's the way we work, with this smallest deliverable and usable value, including all product layers. And what are those layers? First of all, data model, then the organization, then the processes, the connectivity, the user interface, the platform, and security. I am going to go deeper in each layer, and to do so, I would like to refer to a concrete example in Bonita in order to make it a bit more realistic and concrete. So to do so, I took an example that we offer, that we propose on Git, on the community, which is the vacation request management, vacation management, where you have several processes, and this is the main process, the vacation request, where you see the requester, you see you have a manager, and also a backup, okay? With different steps. Some of them are human tasks, some of them are service tasks. This process is quite clear for everybody, but has a certain complexity. So let's start. If we want to build the future, we have to make sure we won't break the past. Why I tell you that? It's because of those dependencies, and also because for the time being, when you work in development, and if you work on a specific version of Bonita, you have to make sure that in production you have a consistency with your development version. And the fact is that with the evolution of the product, changes can occur in the way to use and to use features. Sorry. So let's start with the data model. Data model is something very important because it's going to manage all your business data. You have different choices. You can use external database, external business database. You can use our native business data model, and you can use business variables directly in the process. If you use the business data model, we we suggest that you do it before anything else, and you try to define it properly, because it will define all the data you are going to use, and their interaction, the way they are structured. And actually, then as you have dependencies, it can be difficult to come back, to step back, sorry, or to remove a column in your database and so on. So we suggest that you start thinking about the business data model before working on your process. And the way to defining it is to make sure that you won't have it unstable if it is changing. So we encourage you to start defining what is already known, for sure. If you have doubts about the way to use data, if you know that they are not really useful for the time being, but they could be used later, keep them for later. But do not start entering everything in your database, in your business data model for the time being. And then you will enrich along the way. Because as you remember, even if you start with the data model, we talk about cycles, iterations. So you start with a small piece, you start thinking about your data model, and then you are going to enrich it and enrich it. For example, if I come back to Bonita, here I have the request, and for example, this task, calendar request pending, this task could be unuseful for the time being. It's a kind of bonus. If I go to my business data model, I will create an object called vacation request. I will give attributes such as the requester ID, the reviewer as well, because we need to know who will approve the request, the start date, return date, data that is really important for the process. But for example, the calendar event ID, this one could be set later. You don't have to set it just at the beginning, because imagine you change the type, or it was not mandatory and it becomes mandatory. You don't know which impact it could have. Then we talk about the organization. What is the organization? Most of the time, customers or companies have already set up the organization. It's already defined. And as you know, almost everybody uses LDAP to set up and define the organization for in their system. And we use LDAP as well to connect to Bonita. So everything is already set up in LDAP and will be used in Bonita, except for roles. So if I go back to Bonita and I go in the organization, we have a typical organization, an example of organization, where you have groups. So the groups is human resources. You have subgroups, for example, research and development. And in those groups, you will have, I will come back to, you will have users that have a membership to a group. But as you can see here, and that comes from LDAP most of the time, as you can see here, there's something additional which is called role. Role is very interesting because it will give you the flexibility to define a kind of, that's clear, a role on the process, on the task. This role can be mapped to the actors then, and make sure that, for example, if you need to have one kind of generic role, you can use it to map groups or users to it. For example, if you have a role project manager, and normally you have a kind of organization where you have a group where all the project managers are grouped, sorry, and in one division you have two project managers that are not in the same organization, but where they should have the same role as the others, because then they have the same responsibilities and they will act more or less the same on the processes. You can use the role for that. What is important to think is that this role is not focused and not specific to a process. This role is really part of the organization. So when you define your organization and the roles, you have to think about the organization in general and have a global vision of how it is structured in order to not to impact one process, but make sure that it can be useful even if your processes change or if you add new processes. You also have actors and actors filters. The actors are going to be the ones that are doing the tasks, so they are the one where we are going to assign a task. And actor filters can be a subdivision of actors. For example, if you want to have backups and delegate tasks for people when, for example, someone is not available. Here, if I go to general, up actors, I have an actor and I have an actor feature, which is requester manager, initiator manager. I hope everything is clear for the time being. Now we are going to switch to processes. Processes are really important because they are the core of your development and your application. Because we don't forget that we build applications based on processes. So how are we going to define the processes? Because you can have any kind of processes. So how to identify them and how to define the way we are going to design them? You remember in the discovery phase, you chose your process. This process is core. It's not too complex, but you can have many steps, for example, many tasks, 15, 20 or more. You can have different actors, 2, 3, 4 types of actors. You have gateways with kind of different paths, escalations, exceptions, and so on. What we recommend is that you start with the happy path, which is the simplest process with no exceptions. And then after that, you are going to work step by step, which means that each iteration, each cycle will be a step of this happy path, where you are going to design it on a collaborative way with users in order to make sure that they agree about what you are going to implement because they have done it with you. So if I come back here, my process is this one. So first of all, I will remove all those requests approved, refused, and so on. And to be honest, I want to start easily. So I just want to start with one actor. So I will remove everything. I will create a first lane with the requester. I will create the first steps where I could, and to be honest, I could remove the calendar request, where I will instantiate the request. Then I will have automated tasks to make sure that it will remove the number of days in the other HR system, for example. But even that could be part of another sprint, for example. And then I will notify my manager. That's all. That could be my first sprint. One actor, okay, 3 steps, a connector, and a form. That's good. And then I have to think also when I'm iterating and adding new values and adding new values. And when you add new values, you are going to add new steps, and you are going to add exceptions and so on. This way, you have to think also about the way you are going to design your processes, because you have no rules. So you can do whatever you want with design. But at some point, if you have lots of steps, it can be impossible to read. So you have to find a good balance between flexibility and complexity. And here you have different solutions, but one good approach could be to think top bottom. You have a main process, and I will go back to Bonita to show you. You have a main process, okay, which is the vacation request, and you want to make sure that the person can cancel his request whenever he wants. So to do so, you have two ways to do it. You can use, for example, what we name call activity. This call activity is a way to call a sub-process. This way you separate the process into pools, and it's easier to design your sub-process and to make sure that you won't mix everything in the same lane. The other way to do it is to use messages, as you can see here. This is a message, cancellation message. Be careful, it's not an email, it's a BPM message that will send information, and that will send information to another process, sorry. And this process is cancel vacation request. This process has been sent, and you see that it will start when receiving the, sorry, here. It will start when receiving the message from the other process to say, okay, I have to cancel. This way, you won't mix everything. So you have different ways to design. So I see there is one question about processes and the way to design. I will answer right now. Is it possible to move back to a previous step, or should I rethink the design and implementation of my process? Well, actually, it depends. Because if you want to make sure you have a way to move back, you could have a step in your process. For example, here. No, not here. I would go back to the up. You can say, okay, I have my steps here, and I want to make sure I have a way to come back. So, or you can add a new step, coming back here with an event handler, which is called hero handler. If you have a hero, it comes back. Or you can have a kind of button in the user interface, save as a draft, and then submit when it's done. So that's a way to do that. So the way to move back to previous steps will be add new tasks to make sure that the process can go back to another step. But be careful, because if you have a connector that sends data to another, for example, to a database, to another application, make sure you won't create inconsistency. Or you can use the draft in the user interface in order to avoid errors, and then the user will be submit only when it's ready. I hope it answers your question. Okay, Marcia, I will answer your question at the end, because I want to move forward, and we already talked about organization, if you don't mind. Okay, next one is connectivity, because of course your process, and that's what BPM is for, will be connected to all your systems. So in order to define your connectivity, you have three possibilities. You have connectors. You can use web services, REST APIs. You can also use the engine API, where you are going to to make actions, to ask the engine to make actions, to get data, for example, to get process information as well. And then you also have the REST API extensions. My advice here would be, if you have, depending on the way you want to do it, if the other systems are open and have APIs, you can use APIs if you are comfortable with it. We have a set of connectors in Bonita that can be used in order to communicate up from Bonita. Here, if you can see, we have different kind of connectors: CMS, CRM, calendar, database, messaging, even social. If, for example, if you want to get regular information from Twitter. And also you can define REST APIs and REST API extensions. And for example, in Enterprise Edition, you have so I'm on Community, so I can't show you, but you also have a kind of wizard helping you to do your REST API extensions. And starting 7.9, we also can use a template of REST API extensions and also on custom widgets to define your own widget or your own extension. So connectivity, really, it's open, and I don't really have a specific best practice to tell you about. Then if we talk about user interface, that's also a big subject, because when you talk about your process, you talk about human task and you talk about interface. And the fact is that you want to bring the best value to your users. So user interface can be internal or external to Bonita. You can develop your own interface. You can use a specific portal out of Bonita and, for example, include forms using iframes. You can also use Bonita, and especially Bonita UI Designer, to create all your application. So how you can do that? You have different ways to do it. Or you can decide that your logic, your process logic, will be in the user interface, or you can decide that your process logic will be kept in the process. So to do so, if I go back to Bonita, when I have set up a task, for example, here I instantiate my process. I want to execute it, and I want sorry, I'm not at the right place. I want to execute it, and I want to make sure that my requester can fill in the form. So to do so, and if I want the logic to remain in the process, I will base my task on the contract. What is the contract? The contract is the link between your data model, so your data, your business data, and the user interface and your process. It will define what the process is expecting, what you can fill in order to make sure that you don't have any inconsistency. Then you are going to go into the UI Designer, our tool to design applications and develop applications, where you will see that here you have forms, pages, layouts, and custom widgets. And here in forms, you have the new forms. List of vacation. Oh, no, sorry, that's not this one. Okay, this one. If you want to keep the logic in the process, you are going to define forms for each step of the process and each task. because they are going to be linked, and the data and everything you will have in the user interface can be integrated in a page or in an application, but will be directly linked to your process. Another way to do it is to set a page and to say, okay, this page will be independent of a task. So I can have on a page different tasks. So I can see different forms appearing while my process is moving forward. So there are two different ways to do it, but on our side on Bonita, for best practices reasons, to make it easier for you to build, we really recommend you to use contracts and to keep the process logic in the process and in your task, rather than pushing everything to the front end. Then be careful for maintenance. For example, if you want to use fragments, which is something available in Enterprise Edition, which will give you the ability to have one kind of template. A fragment is a template with the same widgets that can be reused in lots of forms. Be careful, for example, if you use live updates in production. That's something we will see when we will talk about production in our last webinar. Make sure that when you have done an update in production, you also do a kind of reverse engineering and do a new cycle, a new iteration to update your fragment and your forms in development. Then we talk about platform. Why do we talk about platform? Because it's really important. The choices that you are going to do about your platforms, your environments, the way you are going to configure everything is mandatory in development and in production. We will have a webinar dedicated to that as well, because it's important. But today what I can say is that you are not obliged to install all your servers, and especially the production servers, at once, everything at once. You can start with the development and the, for example, testing server, qualification server, to make sure that you can put the continuous integration in place. We recommend you to use automation as much as possible to make sure that you can minimize the time between your iteration and also minimize human errors. And so you can use, for example, Bonita Continuous Delivery, where you have all the tools from collaboration till delivery automation. And then as you have to deploy multiple artifacts, make sure that your platform is configured to give you the ability to do that and to be flexible. So you start with the development and qualification server in the version you are developing with, and then you can choose the best version in production. Just pay attention about something, is the fact that if you develop with, for example, 7.9.4 with Bonita 7.9.4, pay attention about your version in production, because we do not guarantee retro compatibility. So if, for example, the new version has changes in the data model, if it includes new features, you might not be able to deploy. So think about it. It's always better to use the same version in development and in production. Then, and to end up with the last topic, security. We always talk about security. Bonita supports natively 3 kinds of single sign-on: SAML2, Kerberos, and CAS. But more than that, what is important is that Bonita is a web app. So as it is a web app, you won't be limited, and you can add as many security layers as you want. We also now give you the ability to secure the REST API calls to BDM since 7.6, if I remember well. So make sure that we do ensure security, but think about it and the way you want to implement it, because depending on your company, you have different levels of security requirements. So, in order to conclude, is there really one magic ingredient for a successful business process automation project? Is there one single way to implement? Is there one methodology, one happy path? No, I would say no. Really, we are talking about BPM. We are talking about something agile. We are talking about projects that needs to be dynamic, that need to be collaborative. Yeah, when we talk about BPM, you say, yeah, but BPM is structured. So why do you say everything is agile? Because even if it's structured, if you use an agile way to build it, you can make it change every time you do a new iteration. You can continuously improve it, and you can avoid going into too much complexity. I know it's not easy to implement it in reality. I know I'm just talking about best practices based on experience, based on what we saw and on what we experience, and also on fails from our partners, us, from our customers as well. But I really hope those best practices might be useful for you. Even if you just use one of them, I hope it will be helpful. So, if we sum up, first of all, build your process step by step and share it regularly, if not constantly, to your users. Then, important thing, think about your data model as much as possible earlier before you start, but please build it progressively and just implement what you are sure about in order to avoid conflicts with dependencies. Even if you can make it change, even if you can merge, it's always a bit complex. Then if we talk about organization, I think it's good to think about roles in general and don't focus on your process. But that's also the case for your, in general. Don't think about your first process only. Think long term. And iterate often in development, but do not iterate that often in production. We recommend you to iterate once a year maximum in production. You need something stable in production. You need something that will work, that will give time to your users to adopt. If you migrate often, it could create instability. That's not what you want. So iterate to bring value, and when you have a release with a set of values that is relevant and that will really improve the user experience, then release. But do not release every 3 months. So I'm done for this webinar. We still have 10 minutes, so if you want to ask your questions, feel free to do it. I will start with the Marcia question because she has been waiting for a long time, but in the meantime, feel free to add them your question in the chat box. So, could you make it a little more clear on how to link Bonita to LDAP organization? In order to do so, we have a tool that is called LDAP Synchronizer, which is an automated tool that will synchronize your LDAP organization and map it and import it in Bonita. So it will import the groups, the users, the groups, the hierarchy. and then you will have to map them to the roles and to actors. What level of customization in terms of styling regarding Bonita Portal is available in the community edition? Starting with 7.9, you can now, customize the theme and the layout by modifying the application description. That was not possible before, but now you change the XML file and you can update it. You just don't have the wizard in the community edition. And in the enterprise edition, you can customize themes and the layouts thanks to the wizard available directly from the studio. Where to begin with Bonita? First step, if you really don't know the product, could be to use our Getting Started tutorial, because it will give you a tutorial to build an application step by step. And we also provide trainings, and especially for community edition, we have a Bonita Camp training where you can see a playlist with videos describing all steps: UI, gateways, the way to design, contracts, studio, etc., etc. So that's a good start. And of course, you can see different technical videos on our YouTube channel. But really, if you want to start, I think Getting Started is a very good resource. Is it possible to unsubmit a task which the user already submitted? Provide a way for the user to undo. Well, actually, it's possible using APIs. So I think it's Engine API. Look, the task has a status, okay? It will have a status assigned, active, I think, archived, and then if you use the status, I think you can change it. But doing undo like step back is not easy to do it. And as I said before, it's very dangerous, because if your process is running, and for example, in these steps, this particular step, you had a kind of gateway or a parallel gateway or a connector that will provide data, you might impact it, and you might have inconsistencies. So that's something you need to be very careful with when doing it. Otherwise, another solution is to define, okay, at this step, I can do it. I want to undo. I want to make sure that this step can be well, cancelled and so on. But this is different, and that cannot be done with community edition. This is where you will introduce unstructured tasks and phases in your process, and you will mix unstructured task will be introduced thanks to an event handler. So an event will imply the behavior of your engine, and this way you can do it. If you want, you can already register for the next webinar. You have the link in the chat box. Thank you, everybody, and have a good day or afternoon.